Hey guys, tonight we descend into the shadowy, scandalous, and occasionally surprising world of Georgian London's underground economy, where desire, desperation, and absolutely no concept of modern sexual identity collided in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes modern dating apps look like a church social organized by your grandmother. Picture this. You're living in an age where homosexuality was punishable by death. Moral authorities patrolled the streets like sexual vigilantes, and the concept of privacy meant hoping the neighbors weren't peering through your shutters. In this world, seeking same-sex companionship wasn't just socially unacceptable. It was literally a capital offense that could end with you dangling from a rope at Tyburn, while crowds cheered and sold pamphlets about your moral failings. Let's be honest about something right from the start. When most people think about 18th and early 19th century London, they picture either Jane Austen's polite drawing rooms or Charles Dickens' grimy workhouses. What they don't imagine is a thriving network of establishments that cater to men seeking intimate companionship with other men. Places that operated in plain sight while maintaining the kind of elaborate secrecy that would make modern speakeasies look amateur. To be fair, calling these places male brothels might be slightly misleading by modern standards. They were more accurately described as molly houses, establishments that served multiple functions as taverns, private clubs, and meeting places where men could socialize, drink, and potentially arrange more intimate encounters. Think of them as the 18th century equivalent of dating apps, social clubs, and hookup sites all rolled into one dimly lit, perpetually risky establishment. The story we're about to explore reveals a hidden London that existed parallel to the official moral order, a world where elaborate codes, secret languages, and careful social navigation meant the difference between companionship and catastrophe. These weren't just places of business. They were complex social ecosystems that developed their own cultures, hierarchies, and survival strategies in response to a legal system that literally wanted them dead. Meanwhile, the men who frequented these establishments came from every level of society. We're talking about aristocrats and artisans, clergymen and common laborers, married men and bachelors, all united by desires that their society considered not just immoral, but fundamentally unnatural. Their stories reveal uncomfortable truths about sexual identity, social hypocrisy, and the human capacity for creating community even under the most hostile circumstances. Of course, this isn't just a story about sex work or underground establishments. It's a window into how Georgian society actually functioned beneath its carefully maintained moral facade. The existence and persistence of molly houses reveals the gap between public morality and private behavior that characterized an era obsessed with respectability while simultaneously indulging in spectacular debauchery. Sound familiar? It should, because the tension between official moral standards and actual human behavior is one of the most consistent themes in human history. Every society that proclaims high moral standards also creates underground spaces where those standards can be safely ignored, and Georgian London was no exception to this pattern. And yet, what makes this story particularly fascinating is how these establishments operated within a legal framework that was genuinely murderous. This wasn't just social disapproval or religious condemnation. Engaging in homosexual activity could literally get you executed, and the authorities were quite serious about enforcing these laws when it suited their purposes. Still, the molly houses persisted for decades, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for protecting their patrons while providing the bayring services and community that their customers desperately needed. Their survival required a combination of social intelligence, political connections, economic savvy, and sheer audacity that would impress modern entrepreneurs. If you thought the modern gig economy was precarious, imagine running a business that catered to desires your government considered so dangerous that they were willing to execute people for indulging them. The operators of Molly houses weren't just entrepreneurs. They were social pioneers who created spaces for human connection in a world determined to prevent it. That's right. We're about to dive into a world where every social interaction carried potentially lethal risks, where elaborate performances of gender and sexuality provided both entertainment and protection, and where the line between criminal enterprise and community service was often impossibly thin. The men and women who created and sustained this underground economy deserve recognition not just as historical curiosities, but as remarkably brave individuals who refused to let their society's moral panics destroy their humanity. Their story is simultaneously inspiring and tragic, revealing both the resilience of human community and the devastating costs of social intolerance. Let's talk about Georgian London's relationship with sex, morality, and money, because understanding this triangle is crucial to grasping how an underground economy of male, intimate services could flourish in a society that was officially committed to executing anyone who participated in it. To be fair, 18th century London's attitude towards sexuality was complicated in ways that would make modern culture warriors weep with confusion. On one hand, you had a legal system that treated homosexual activity as a capital offense under the buggery statutes, with punishments that could include death by hanging. On the other hand, you had a city with nearly 1 million inhabitants, limited law enforcement, and a culture that was simultaneously obsessed with moral propriety and absolutely notorious for its sexual permissiveness. It was like having speed limits enforced by a police force that consisted of 3 officers for the entire city. Meanwhile, London's economy was increasingly driven by service industries that catered to every imaginable human appetite. The city had hundreds of female brothels, countless drinking establishments, gambling houses, theaters, and entertainment venues that operated with varying degrees of legal approval. In this context, the emergence of establishments catering to men seeking male companionship wasn't aberrant. It was almost inevitable. The social context that allowed Molly houses to develop was rooted in London's unique combination of anonymity and opportunity. Unlike rural areas where everyone knew everyone else's business, London offered the possibility of creating alternative identities and social networks. A man could live a respectable life in one neighborhood while maintaining entirely different social connections elsewhere in the city. Of course, this anonymity came with significant costs. The men who frequented Molly houses were constantly navigating between their public personas and their private desires, which required elaborate forms of social performance that were exhausting and psychologically demanding. They had to become expert actors, capable of switching between different identities depending on their social context. Still, the economic opportunities created by London's size and wealth provided the foundation for all kinds of underground activities. The city had enough wealthy men to support specialized services, enough poor men willing to provide those services, and enough corruption in the legal system to ensure that the right bribes could buy considerable protection. By the early 18th century, London's Molly houses had developed into sophisticated operations that combined multiple revenue streams. They typically functioned as taverns or coffee houses during normal business hours, providing legitimate income while serving as cover for their less legal activities. During evening hours or in private rooms, they facilitated more intimate encounters between their patrons. The economic model was actually quite clever. Rather than operating as simple brothels where customers paid for specific services, Molly houses typically charged for access to social spaces where men could meet each other. This approach provided some legal protection, It was harder to prosecute someone for running a drinking establishment and for operating a house of prostitution. And yet, the financial arrangements were often more complex than simple fee-for-service transactions. Many molly houses operated more like private clubs, where regular patrons paid membership fees or made ongoing financial contributions in exchange for access to the establishment and its social network. This created ongoing relationships between operators and customers that provided stability for both sides. Meanwhile, the men who worked in these establishments came from a variety of backgrounds and operated under different arrangements. Some were independent operators who used molly houses as places to meet potential customers. Others were more directly employed by the establishments, receiving wages or housing in exchange for their services. Still others were simply community members who participated in the social life of these places without necessarily engaging in commercial transactions. The economic relationships within molly houses reflected the broader economic inequalities of Georgian society. Wealthy patrons could afford private rooms, expensive drinks, and generous tips that ensured preferential treatment. Working class customers typically had access to common areas and more basic services. The establishments had to carefully balance the needs of different customer segments while maintaining the discreet atmosphere that everyone required. Let's be clear about something important. The economics of molly houses weren't just about individual transactions. These establishments served as economic lifelines for men who had limited opportunities for legitimate employment due to their sexual interests or effeminate behavior. In a society that offered few alternatives, molly houses provided both income and community for people who might otherwise have faced destitution. To be fair, the financial risks of operating or frequenting molly houses were enormous. A single raid or prosecution could destroy not just individual livelihoods, but entire social networks. The operators had to maintain careful relationships with local authorities, which typically involved regular bribes and political contributions that ate into their profits. The pricing structures of molly houses reflected these risks and operational costs. Services were generally more expensive than comparable offerings in female brothels, partly because of the additional legal risks and partly because of the smaller customer base. The men who frequented these establishments typically paid premium prices for discretion and security. Of course, the underground nature of the economy meant that financial disputes couldn't be resolved through normal legal channels. This created unique challenges for both operators and customers, who had to develop alternative methods for handling disagreements, collecting debts, and maintaining business relationships. Trust became the fundamental currency of the molly house economy. Still, the persistence and growth of these establishments throughout the 18th century suggests that they were meeting genuine economic and social needs that weren't being addressed by legitimate institutions. The demand for these services was clearly strong enough to sustain multiple establishments despite the considerable risks involved. The molly house economy also intersected with other underground activities in Georgian London. Many establishments had connections to criminal networks, smuggling operations, and political corruption schemes that provided additional revenue streams and protection mechanisms. This integration into broader underground economies helped insulate molly houses from law enforcement while creating additional vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the seasonal patterns of London's economy affected molly house operations in predictable ways. Business typically increased during winter months when wealthy customers returned to the city from their country estates, and during major social seasons when London's population swelled with visitors. Operators had to carefully manage cash flow to survive leaner periods. The geographic distribution of molly houses reflected the economic geography of Georgian London. Most were located in areas that combined commercial activity with residential neighborhoods, providing both foot traffic and discreet access. They avoided the most fashionable districts, where scrutiny was intense, and the poorest areas, where customers feared for their safety. And yet, the most successful Molly houses developed strategies for attracting customers from across London's social spectrum. They offered different services at different price points, maintained varying levels of luxury and discretion, and cultivated reputations that appealed to specific customer segments while maintaining broad enough appeal to ensure financial viability. The economic success of Molly houses also depended on their ability to maintain relationships with legitimate businesses that provided essential services. They needed suppliers for food and drink, landlords willing to rent them space, and service providers who wouldn't ask too many questions about their activities. Building these networks required considerable social skill and financial resources. That's right. The Molly house economy wasn't just about immediate sexual or social transactions. It was a complex ecosystem of relationships, dependencies, and mutual obligations that sustained an entire underground community. Understanding these economic dynamics is crucial to grasping how these establishments could persist for decades despite constant legal threats. Sound familiar? It should, because the basic dynamics of underground economies, the need for discretion, the importance of trust, the challenges of operating outside legal protection, remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and social contexts. The specific details change, but the fundamental patterns persist. If you thought modern entrepreneurs faced regulatory challenges, imagine trying to run a customer service business where your core offering could get both you and your customers executed if discovered by the wrong people. The operators of Molly houses weren't just business people. They were social engineers who created sustainable community institutions under impossibly hostile circumstances. Now let's dive into the actual establishments themselves, because the Molly houses of Georgian London were far more complex and fascinating than simple commercial transactions would suggest. These weren't just places where men paid for services. They were elaborate social institutions that developed their own cultures, rituals, and survival strategies in response to a hostile world. The term Molly itself provides our first clue about the sophisticated social dynamics at play in these establishments. Molly was 18th century slang for an effeminate man or someone who engaged in homosexual activity, but it was also used more broadly to describe the entire subculture that developed around these spaces. Think of it as both an identity category and a community designation that created belonging for people who had few other options for social connection. Let's be honest about what made Molly houses unique in the landscape of Georgian London's entertainment venues. They weren't just serving alcohol or facilitating casual encounters. They were creating elaborate theatrical environments where customers could explore alternative identities and social roles that were impossible in their everyday lives. Many Molly houses featured regular entertainments that would seem bizarre by modern standards, but made perfect sense within their social context. Cross-dressing performances were common, with customers and workers adopting exaggerated feminine personas complete with women's names, elaborate costumes, and theatrical mannerisms. These weren't just sexual performances, they were complex identity play that allowed participants to temporarily inhabit different social roles. To be fair, these performances served multiple functions beyond entertainment. The theatrical nature of Molly house culture provided a form of protection by allowing participants to claim they were simply engaging in harmless entertainment rather than serious sexual activity. If authorities raided an establishment, finding men and women's clothing engaging in obviously theatrical behavior was less legally damaging than discovering evidence of actual sodomy. The most famous Molly house in 18th century London was probably Mother Clapp's, operated by Margaret Clapp in Holborn from the 1720s until her arrest in 1726. Mother Clapp's establishment provides an excellent case study in how these venues operated, because court records from her trial give us detailed information about the daily life of a successful Molly house. Mother Clapp's operated as a coffee house during the day and transformed into a social club for Mollies in the evening. The establishment featured a main room where customers could drink, socialize, and watch performances, as well as private rooms upstairs where more intimate encounters could take place. Margaret Clapp charged admission for access to the social spaces and rented private rooms to customers who wanted privacy. Of course, Mother Clapp's also featured the elaborate mock weddings that became characteristic of Molly house culture. These ceremonies involved customers dressed in wedding attire, complete with bridesmaids, wedding feasts, and honeymoon retirements to private rooms. The weddings were simultaneously parodies of heterosexual marriage and genuine expressions of partnership within the Molly community. Meanwhile, the social hierarchies within Molly houses reflected both the broader social inequalities of Georgian society and the specific dynamics of this underground community. Wealthy customers typically received preferential treatment and had access to the most attractive partners and private accommodations. But Molly houses also created opportunities for social mobility that didn't exist in legitimate society. Young men from poor backgrounds could achieve considerable status within Molly house communities through their attractiveness, personality, or performance skills. Some developed relationships with wealthy patrons that provided long-term financial security and social protection. These arrangements were simultaneously commercial transactions and genuine emotional relationships that blur modern categories of sex work and romantic partnership. Still, the most successful Molly houses developed sophisticated strategies for managing their diverse clientele while maintaining the discreet atmosphere that everyone required. They typically had regular customers who formed the core community, occasional visitors who were carefully vetted before being admitted, and elaborate systems for identifying and excluding potential threats. The physical layout of Molly houses reflected their need to balance accessibility with security. Most featured multiple entrances and exits, private rooms that could be quickly cleared if necessary, and careful sightlines that allowed operators to monitor who was entering and leaving. Some had secret passages or hidden rooms that could be used to hide evidence or evacuate customers during raids. And yet, despite these security measures, Molly houses were surprisingly public institutions that were well known to their neighbors and local authorities. This openness might seem contradictory given the legal risks involved, but it actually served important protective functions. Establishments that operated openly were less likely to be seen as genuinely threatening than those that tried to maintain complete secrecy. The daily operations of Molly houses required considerable management skills and social intelligence. Operators had to maintain relationships with local authorities, manage diverse staff and customer bases, coordinate entertainment and social events, and handle the financial and logistical challenges of running an illegal business. Many of the women who operated these establishments were remarkable entrepreneurs who built sustainable businesses under extremely challenging circumstances. By the 1720s, London had at least 20 known Molly houses operating simultaneously, with new establishments opening regularly to serve different neighborhoods and customer segments. Some specialized in wealthy clientele and featured luxurious accommodations and high-end entertainment. Others catered to working-class customers and offered basic services at affordable prices. The entertainment offerings at Molly houses evolved throughout the 18th century, reflecting both changing customer preferences and the need to stay ahead of moral reformers who constantly criticized these establishments. Early Molly houses featured relatively simple drinking and socializing, but later venues developed elaborate themed events, costume parties, and performance spectacles that would have impressed legitimate theaters. Let's be clear about the role that alcohol played in Molly House culture, because drinking wasn't just social lubrication. It was central to the economic model and social dynamics of these establishments. Alcohol sales provided legitimate revenue that helped cover operating costs, and the social effects of drinking helped create the relaxed atmosphere that customers sought. Meanwhile, the staff of Molly houses typically included a diverse mix of people who performed different functions within these complex social ecosystems. Operators and managers typically were women who had the social skills and connections necessary to maintain relationships with authorities and customers. Male staff included servers, entertainers, and sex workers who provided various services to customers. The relationships between staff and customers in Molly houses were often much more complex than simple commercial transactions. Many establishments developed elaborate social hierarchies where long-term customers became quasi-family members who participated in the daily life of the house. Some customers provided financial support during difficult periods, while staff members offered emotional support and social connection that customers couldn't find elsewhere. Of course, the mock weddings and other ceremonial aspects of Molly house culture served important psychological functions for participants who had few other opportunities to publicly acknowledge their relationships and identities. These ceremonies provided community recognition and validation that was completely unavailable in legitimate society. The seasonal patterns of Molly House operations reflected the broader rhythms of Georgian London's social life. Business typically peaked during winter months when wealthy customers returned to the city, during major social events like coronations or royal celebrations, and during holidays when people had extra money and leisure time. Operators had to carefully manage resources to survive slower periods. Still, the most successful Molly houses developed strategies for maintaining community even during difficult periods. They offered credit to regular customers during hard times, provided housing and support for community members who faced unemployment or illness, and created social bonds that extended beyond simple commercial relationships. The geographic networks of Molly houses created a citywide community that allowed customers to travel between establishments and maintain social connections across different neighborhoods. Regular customers often knew the operators and staff of multiple houses, creating an informal communication network that provided information about new establishments, potential threats, and community news. And yet, the competition between Molly houses could be intense, particularly when targeting similar customer segments. Establishments competed for the most attractive staff, the best entertainment, and the wealthiest customers. This competition drove innovation in services and amenities, while sometimes creating conflicts within the broader Molly community. The cultural innovations that emerged from Molly houses influenced broader London society in ways that are often overlooked by historians. The elaborate costumes, theatrical performances, and social rituals developed in these establishments contributed to Georgian London's reputation for entertainment and cultural creativity. Some Molly House entertainers became legitimate performers in mainstream theaters and social venues. That's right, Molly houses weren't just serving their immediate communities. They were cultural laboratories that experimented with new forms of entertainment, social organization, and identity expression that influenced the broader development of Georgian popular culture. Their innovations in performance, hospitality, and community building provided models that were adopted by legitimate establishments. Sound familiar? It should, because underground communities have always served as sources of cultural innovation and eventually influence mainstream society. The specific forms change, but the pattern of marginalized communities developing creative solutions that are later adopted by dominant cultures remains remarkably consistent across different historical periods. If you thought modern nightlife was complex Imagine trying to create sustainable entertainment venues, where every aspect of your operation had to be carefully calibrated to provide genuine community, while avoiding the attention of authorities who were quite literally trying to kill your customers. The operators of Molly houses weren't just running businesses. They were creating alternative societies. Let's talk about the actual people who made Molly house culture possible, because their stories reveal a remarkable diversity of individuals who found community in these underground establishments. We're not just talking about stereotypical characters. We're looking at aristocrats and laborers, married men and bachelors, clergy and criminals, all united by desires that their society considered not just immoral, but literally deadly. The patrons of Molly houses came from every level of Georgian society, which might surprise people who assume that only marginalized individuals would risk such dangerous associations. Court records and contemporary accounts reveal customers who included members of parliament, military officers, wealthy merchants, respected professionals, and ordinary working men who somehow found the resources to participate in this expensive underground economy. To be fair, the social diversity of Molly house patrons reflected the reality that same-sex desire wasn't limited to any particular social class or demographic group. What varied was people's ability to manage the risks and costs associated with participating in illegal activities. Wealthy men had more resources for discretion and legal protection, while working-class men often faced more severe consequences if discovered. One of the most fascinating aspects of Molly house culture was how it created opportunities for social interaction between men who would never have associated with each other in legitimate society. Aristocrats could form relationships with artisans, elderly gentlemen could socialize with young apprentices, and married family men could explore desires that were completely incompatible with their public personas. Meanwhile, the operators of Molly houses were predominantly women, which created interesting dynamics in establishments that catered primarily to male customers. These women typically had backgrounds in the hospitality industry. They were former tavern keepers, brothel operators, or boarding house managers who recognized the business opportunity created by unmet demand for specialized services. Margaret Clapp, the operator of the most famous Molly house in Georgian London, provides an excellent example of the entrepreneurial women who built this underground economy. Clapp was a middle-aged widow who operated her establishment for several years before being arrested in 1726. Court testimony reveals that she was respected by her customers, protective of their privacy, and skilled at managing the complex social dynamics of her establishment. Of course, the male staff of Molly houses included a diverse range of individuals who participated in this economy for different reasons. Some were professional sex workers who specialized in male clients. Others were young men from poor backgrounds who used their attractiveness and social skills to improve their economic circumstances. Still others were community members who worked in these establishments as much for social connection as for financial gain. The age demographics of Molly house participants reveal important information about how these communities functioned. While popular imagination often focuses on young male sex workers, court records show that customers and staff included men ranging from teenagers to elderly individuals. Some Molly houses specifically catered to older men who sought companionship with peers rather than commercial transactions with much younger partners. Let's be honest about the role that marriage played in Molly house culture, because many patrons were married men who maintained conventional family lives while seeking same-sex companionship in underground venues. This wasn't necessarily hypocrisy. It reflected the reality that Georgian society offered no legitimate options for men who experienced both heterosexual and homosexual desires. Still, the psychological burden of maintaining double lives was enormous for married men who frequented Molly houses. They had to constantly navigate between their family responsibilities and their private desires, which required elaborate deception and careful resource management that was exhausting and emotionally demanding. The clergy who frequented Molly houses faced particularly complex challenges, since their professional roles required them to publicly condemn the very behaviors they privately engaged in. Court records reveal that Molly houses served several members of the clergy, including both Anglican priests and nonconformist ministers who risked not just legal punishment but complete professional and social destruction if discovered. And yet, some clergy members became important community leaders within Molly house culture, using their education and social skills to help organize events, mediate disputes, and provide counsel to other community members. Their participation reveals the gap between public religious rhetoric and private, spiritual practice that characterized many aspects of Georgian society. The military officers who patronized Molly houses created additional layers of complexity within these communities. Military culture was aggressively masculine and officially hostile to homosexual activity. But the realities of military life extended periods away from women. Intense male bonding and high-stress environments created conditions where same-sex relationships often developed. Meanwhile, the working-class men who participated in Molly house culture often faced the most severe economic and social consequences if discovered. They typically had fewer resources for legal protection, less ability to relocate if their reputations were destroyed, and more limited options for alternative employment. Their participation in this expensive underground economy often required significant financial sacrifice. The international character of London's population was reflected in Molly house communities, which included immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, continental Europe, and even distant colonies. These men often faced additional vulnerabilities due to their foreign status, but they also brought cultural perspectives and social connections that enriched the diversity of these underground communities. Of course, the relationships that developed within Molly houses weren't always harmonious. Like any social environment, these establishments experienced personality conflicts, romantic jealousies, financial disputes, and status competitions that sometimes escalated into serious problems. Operators had to develop sophisticated conflict resolution skills to maintain the peaceful atmosphere that customers required. The economic relationships between patrons and staff in Molly houses varied considerably depending on individual circumstances and preferences. Some customers paid fixed fees for specific services, while others developed ongoing financial relationships that resembled patronage arrangements. Some staff members worked independently and retained all their earnings, while others shared revenue with house operators. Still, the most successful Molly houses created genuine communities where financial transactions were embedded within broader social relationships. Long-term customers often provided support for staff members during illness or unemployment, while staff members offered emotional support and companionship that extended beyond immediate commercial arrangements. The theatrical aspects of Molly house culture attracted participants who were interested in performance and entertainment as much as sexual services. Some customers were primarily interested in the cross-dressing entertainments and mock ceremonies that these establishments offered. Others participated in the performances themselves, using Molly houses as venues for exploring artistic and creative interests that weren't available in legitimate theaters. And yet, the constant threat of legal persecution created psychological pressures that affected everyone involved in Molly house communities. Participants had to maintain constant vigilance about potential threats, carefully manage their social connections, and live with the knowledge that their activities could result in imprisonment, public humiliation, or execution. The survival strategies developed by Molly house participants reveal remarkable creativity and resilience in the face of systematic persecution. They created elaborate codes for communicating safely, developed networks for warning each other about potential threats, and established alternative social connections that could provide support if their underground activities were discovered. Meanwhile, the aging process created particular challenges for Molly House communities, since older participants often lost the physical attractiveness or economic resources that had originally provided them access to these social networks. Successful Molly houses developed strategies for supporting aging community members, while maintaining their appeal to younger customers. The documentation of Molly house culture that survives comes primarily from court records and moral reform literature, which creates significant bias in how these communities are remembered. The voices of participants themselves are largely absent from the historical record, making it difficult to understand their own perspectives on their experiences and choices. That's right. The people who created and sustained Molly house culture were far more diverse and complex than the stereotypes suggest. They weren't just sexual deviants or social outcasts. They were ordinary human beings who found creative ways to build community and pursue happiness despite living under a legal system that was determined to destroy them. Sound familiar? It should, because the human need for community and connection transcends legal restrictions and social disapproval. The specific forms change, but the underlying drive to create meaningful relationships and supportive communities remains constant across different historical periods and social contexts. If you thought modern dating was complicated, imagine trying to build intimate relationships and lasting friendships in a social environment where expressing your authentic self could literally get you killed. The participants in Molly house culture weren't just seeking sexual gratification. They were creating alternative families and support networks that provided meaning and connection in an otherwise hostile world. Now we need to talk about the other side of this story, the legal system, moral reformers, and social authorities who were absolutely determined to destroy Molly house culture and everyone associated with it. Because while we've been exploring these establishments as fascinating social institutions, it's crucial to understand that they operated under constant threat from a justice system that considered their very existence an offense against God, nature, and social order. Let's be clear about the legal framework that governed homosexual activity in Georgian England. It wasn't just illegal. It was classified as a capital offense that could result in death by hanging. The Buggery Act of 1533 had made sodomy punishable by death, and while prosecutions were relatively rare, the authorities were quite serious about enforcement when they chose to pursue cases. The legal category of sodomy was both broader and narrower than modern concepts of homosexuality. It technically applied only to anal penetration, which meant that many activities that took place in Molly houses didn't technically qualify for capital punishment. But it also applied to any anal penetration, regardless of the genders involved, which meant that even heterosexual couples could theoretically face execution for certain sexual practices. To be fair, the practical enforcement of anti-sodomy laws was complicated by the difficulty of obtaining evidence that would satisfy legal requirements. Sodomy prosecutions required either eyewitness testimony to actual penetration or physical evidence that was often impossible to obtain. This evidentiary burden meant that most Molly house activities fell into legal gray areas that were difficult to prosecute successfully. Meanwhile, the authorities developed alternative legal strategies for attacking Molly houses when direct sodomy prosecutions weren't feasible. They could charge operators and customers with keeping a disorderly house, conspiracy to commit sodomy, or various public morality offenses that carried lesser but still serious penalties, including imprisonment, fines, and public humiliation. The famous raid on Mother Claps, Molly House in 1726, provides an excellent case study in how the legal system approached these prosecutions. The raid was carefully planned and executed by constables who had been monitoring the establishment for months. They arrested dozens of customers and staff, though only a few were ultimately prosecuted successfully. Of course, the legal proceedings that followed Molly House raids were often as much about public theater as actual justice. The trials provided opportunities for moral authorities to denounce sexual deviance, for newspapers to sell sensational stories, and for the general public to express their moral superiority while simultaneously learning titillating details about underground sexual culture. The testimony from Molly House trials reveals fascinating information about how these establishments operated, but it also shows how legal proceedings distorted and sensationalized the reality of these communities. Witnesses were encouraged to emphasize the most shocking aspects of Molly House culture while downplaying the ordinary social interactions that characterized daily life in these establishments. Still, the legal system's approach to Molly houses wasn't consistently harsh or systematic. Prosecutions typically occurred in waves that reflected broader political and social pressures rather than steady law enforcement. Periods of intense persecution alternated with years of relative tolerance, creating an unpredictable environment that made long-term planning difficult for operators and customers. The role of moral reform societies in targeting Molly houses became increasingly important throughout the 18th century. Organizations like the Society for the Reformation of Manners actively investigated suspected establishments, gathered evidence for prosecutions, and lobbied for stricter enforcement of existing laws. These groups combined genuine moral conviction with considerable political influence. And yet, the effectiveness of legal persecution in actually eliminating Molly House culture was limited by the same factors that allowed these establishments to flourish in the first place. London was too large and diverse for comprehensive surveillance. Law enforcement resources were too limited for systematic prosecution, and the demand for these services was too strong to be eliminated by occasional raids. The punishment of individuals convicted in Molly House cases varied considerably depending on their social status, the specific charges, and the political climate at the time of their trials. Wealthy defendants often received lighter sentences or were able to flee the country before prosecution. Working-class men typically faced the full severity of the law, including execution in some cases. Meanwhile, the public humiliation that accompanied Molly House prosecutions was often as devastating as the formal legal penalties. Defendants' names and alleged activities were published in newspapers. Their reputations were permanently destroyed, and their families often faced social ostracism that could last for generations. The social consequences of prosecution extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The geographic patterns of Molly House prosecutions reveal important information about how law enforcement priorities were shaped by local politics and social pressures. Areas with active moral reform societies experienced more frequent raids, while neighborhoods with corruption or tolerance among local officials often provided safer havens for underground establishments. By the 1750s, the legal approach to Molly houses began to shift toward more systematic surveillance and prosecution strategies. The authorities developed networks of informants within these communities, conducted longer-term investigations, and coordinated raids across multiple establishments simultaneously. These tactics were more effective at disrupting Molly House operations, but required considerable resources and coordination. Let's be honest about the role that class bias played in Molly House prosecutions, because wealthy defendants almost always fare better than poor ones, regardless of the evidence against them. Aristocratic customers could typically avoid prosecution entirely through political connections or financial influence, while working-class participants faced the full severity of the law. The international dimensions of Molly House culture created additional complications for law enforcement. Some establishments catered to foreign visitors or maintained connections to similar venues in other countries. These international networks made investigation more difficult while providing escape routes for individuals who face prosecution. In England, of course, the moral panic surrounding Molly houses reflected broader anxieties about social change, gender roles, and political authority that characterized Georgian society. The targeting of these establishments wasn't just about sexual morality. It was about maintaining social hierarchies and cultural norms that were perceived to be under threat from rapid urbanization and economic change. The press coverage of Molly House trials reveals how these prosecutions were used to reinforce conventional gender roles and sexual norms. Newspapers emphasized the unnatural behavior of defendants while promoting idealized versions of masculine behavior that were supposedly threatened by the existence of these establishments. The coverage was simultaneously condemnatory and titillating, satisfying moral outrage while providing entertaining scandal. Still, the legal system's treatment of Molly houses wasn't uniformly hostile. Some judges and prosecutors showed reluctance to pursue capital cases based on what they considered private moral failings, and juries sometimes refused to convict defendants despite clear evidence of illegal activity. The law was harsh, but its application was inconsistent and often influenced by personal sympathy or political considerations. The development of blackmail as a strategy for targeting Molly House participants reveals how legal persecution created opportunities for criminal exploitation. Men who frequented these establishments were vulnerable to extortion because exposure would destroy their reputations and potentially result in legal prosecution. This created a shadow economy of blackmail that was often more damaging than official law enforcement. And yet, some Molly House operators developed sophisticated strategies for protecting their customers from both legal prosecution and criminal exploitation. They maintained careful records of customer preferences and activities that could be used to provide alibis if necessary, and they developed networks of contacts within the legal system who could provide warnings about potential raids or prosecutions. Role of religious authorities in targeting Molly houses was complicated by the fact that some clergy members were themselves customers of these establishments. Official church rhetoric condemned sexual deviance, while unofficial church practice often involved considerable tolerance for human weakness. This contradiction created opportunities for both persecution and protection. Meanwhile, the political dimensions of Molly House prosecutions became increasingly important as these cases were used to attack political opponents or demonstrate moral credentials. Politicians could enhance their reputations by supporting aggressive prosecution of sexual deviance, while their enemies' involvement in these establishments could be used to destroy careers and political movements. The international legal context also influenced how English authorities approached Molly House prosecutions. Other European countries had different laws and enforcement practices regarding homosexual activity, which created complications for cases involving foreign nationals or international networks. English authorities sometimes faced diplomatic pressure to moderate their enforcement practices. The economic costs of prosecuting Molly houses were considerable, requiring extensive investigation, surveillance, and trial proceedings that strained limited law enforcement resources. The authorities had to balance their moral objectives against practical considerations about resource allocation and enforcement priorities. By the 1760s, changes in English legal procedure began to affect Molly House prosecutions. New evidence requirements and procedural protections made successful prosecutions more difficult, while growing skepticism about capital punishment for moral offenses reduced the severity of sentences. These changes didn't eliminate legal persecution, but they made it somewhat less deadly. The development of more sophisticated legal defenses also help protect Molly House participants from the most severe consequences of prosecution. Defense attorneys learned to challenge evidence, question witness credibility, and exploit procedural requirements in ways that made successful prosecution more difficult. The legal profession gradually developed expertise in defending these cases. Of course, the social impact of Molly House prosecutions extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. These cases reinforced social stigma against homosexual activity, discouraged the development of visible communities, and created psychological trauma that affected entire social networks. The legal system didn't just punish individuals. It attacked the social structures that supported alternative sexual communities. The documentation that survives from Molly House trials provides invaluable historical information about these communities, but it also represents a biased perspective that emphasizes the most sensational and criminal aspects of these establishments. The legal records don't capture the ordinary social interactions, emotional relationships, and community support that characterize daily life in these venues. Still, the persistence of Molly House culture, despite intensive legal persecution, demonstrates the remarkable resilience of these communities and the strength of the human needs they served. People continued to risk imprisonment and execution to participate in these social networks, suggesting that they provided something essential that couldn't be found elsewhere in Georgian society. The gradual decline of Molly House prosecutions in the late 18th century reflected changing attitudes toward private morality as much as changes in the communities themselves. The authorities became more focused on public order and political threats, while sexual behavior was increasingly seen as a private matter that didn't require intensive government intervention. That's right. The legal war against Molly houses wasn't just about enforcing sexual morality. It was about maintaining social control, reinforcing political authority, and demonstrating the power of established institutions to shape private behavior. The specific targets changed, but the underlying dynamic of using legal persecution to maintain social conformity remained constant. Sound familiar? It should, because the use of legal systems to attack marginalized communities while claiming to protect public morality is one of the most persistent patterns in human history. The specific laws and enforcement mechanisms evolve, but the basic strategy of using official authority to suppress alternative communities remains remarkably consistent across different societies and historical periods. If you thought modern legal systems were complex and sometimes contradictory, imagine living under laws that could literally execute you for private consensual behavior, while simultaneously tolerating massive public corruption and violence. The Georgian legal system's approach to Molly houses reveals the arbitrary and political nature of moral enforcement that continues to characterize legal systems around the world. Let's talk money, because understanding the economics of Molly houses reveals how these establishments managed to survive and even thrive despite operating under constant legal threat. We're not just talking about simple transactions. We're looking at complex business models that had to balance profit maximization with risk management in ways that would challenge modern entrepreneurs. The basic economics of Molly houses were complicated by their need to maintain multiple revenue streams while minimizing legal exposure. Most establishments operated as legitimate taverns or coffee houses during normal business hours, providing food, drink, and social space to ordinary customers who had no interest in their underground activities. This legitimate business provided both cover and baseline revenue that helped sustain operations during difficult periods. To be fair, the overhead costs of operating Molly houses were considerably higher than those of comparable legitimate businesses. Operators had to pay bribes to local authorities, maintain security measures that weren't necessary for normal establishments, and charge prices that reflected the additional risks associated with their illegal activities. These costs were passed on to customers through premium pricing. That made Molly House services expensive relative to other entertainment options. Meanwhile, the pricing structures of Molly houses had to accommodate customers from different social classes while maintaining the discreet atmosphere that everyone required. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for private rooms, exclusive access, and high-end services. Working-class customers typically had access to common areas and basic services at lower prices. This tiered pricing model maximized revenue while maintaining broad customer appeal. The payment methods used in Molly houses reflected both the need for discretion and the realities of 18th century commerce. Most transactions were conducted in cash to avoid creating paper trails that could be used as evidence in legal proceedings. Some regular customers maintained accounts that were settled periodically, while others paid for services in advance. To ensure access during busy periods, of course, the seasonal patterns of Molly House business created significant cash flow challenges that operators had to manage carefully. Business typically peaked during winter months when wealthy customers returned to London from their country estates, during major social events that brought visitors to the city, and during holidays when people had extra money for entertainment. Operators had to save money during profitable periods to survive leaner times. Still, the most successful Molly houses developed strategies for generating revenue year-round through diversified service offerings. Some hosted special events like mock weddings or costume parties that attracted customers willing to pay premium prices for unique entertainment. Others developed catering or accommodation services that provided additional income streams beyond their core activities. The staffing economics of Molly houses were particularly complex because these establishments required workers who combined commercial skills with the social intelligence necessary to navigate underground culture. Operators typically employed a mix of full-time staff who received wages and housing, part-time workers who were paid per service or per event, and independent contractors who used the establishments as venues for meeting customers. And yet, the employment relationships in Molly houses often extended beyond simple commercial transactions. Many establishments provided housing, meals, and social support for staff members who had limited alternatives for employment due to their involvement in illegal activities. These arrangements created loyalty and stability while also increasing operational costs. Let's be honest about the role that credit and debt played in Molly House economics, because many customers and staff members operated on informal financial arrangements that reflected the trust relationships within these communities. Regular customers often purchased services on credit that was settled weekly or monthly, while staff members sometimes received advances against future earnings. The geographic economics of Molly houses reflected the commercial geography of Georgian London. Establishments in wealthy neighborhoods could charge higher prices but faced greater scrutiny from authorities and moral reformers. Venues in working-class areas had access to larger customer bases but had to operate on smaller profit margins. The most successful operators often ran multiple establishments in different neighborhoods to diversify their risk and revenue sources. Meanwhile, the supply chain management for Molly houses required careful attention to maintaining relationships with legitimate suppliers while avoiding unnecessary exposure to legal risk. Operators needed reliable sources for food, drink, furnishings, and other materials that they couldn't afford to work with suppliers who might report their activities to authorities. The inventory management challenges faced by Molly houses were unique in the entertainment industry. They had to maintain stocks of alcohol, food, and entertainment materials while also keeping costumes, theatrical props, and specialized equipment used for their underground activities. This inventory had to be managed in ways that could be quickly hidden or explained if authorities conducted raids. Of course, the insurance and risk management strategies available to Molly House operators were severely limited by the illegal nature of their activities. They couldn't purchase normal business insurance or legal protection, which meant that fires, thefts, or other disasters could completely destroy their investments without any recourse for recovery. Still, some Molly House operators developed informal insurance arrangements within their communities, where successful establishments provided financial support to venues that experienced difficulties. These mutual aid networks helped stabilize the industry while creating bonds of loyalty and cooperation between potential competitors. The accounting practices of Molly houses had to balance the need for financial management with the requirement for discretion. Most operators maintained minimal written records that could be explained as legitimate tavern business if discovered by authorities. Important financial information was often kept mentally or in coded forms that would be meaningless to outsiders. And yet, the financial success of Molly houses is demonstrated by their persistence and growth throughout the 18th century. Despite the considerable risks and costs involved, these establishments continue to attract investment and generate profits sufficient to sustain operations and expand into new markets. This suggests that they were meeting genuine demand that wasn't being satisfied by legitimate businesses. The tax implications of Molly House operations were complicated by their semi-legal status. Operators typically paid normal business taxes on their legitimate tavern activities while avoiding reporting income from their underground services. This created potential legal vulnerabilities, but also provided some protection by demonstrating compliance with tax obligations. Meanwhile, the wealth accumulation strategies available to Molly House operators were limited by the need to maintain low profiles and avoid attracting attention through ostentatious displays of success. Many successful operators invested their profits in legitimate businesses or real estate that could provide alternative income sources if their underground activities were discovered. The competitive dynamics within the Molly House industry were influenced by both commercial considerations and community relationships. Establishments competed for customers and staff while also maintaining cooperative relationships that helped protect the entire industry from legal persecution. This balance between competition and cooperation required considerable social skill and business acumen. The economic impact of Molly houses on their surrounding communities was generally positive, despite the moral opposition they faced. These establishments provided employment, purchased goods and services from local suppliers, and attracted customers who spent money at other businesses. Their economic contributions helped build tolerance among neighbors who might otherwise have opposed their activities. That's right, Molly houses weren't just underground entertainment venues. They were sophisticated businesses that developed innovative strategies for managing risk, serving diverse customer bases, and maintaining profitability under extremely challenging circumstances. Their economic models provide insights into how marginalized communities create sustainable institutions despite systematic opposition. Sound familiar? It should, because the basic challenges faced by Molly House operators, managing legal risk, serving diverse customers, maintaining discrete operations, and building sustainable revenue streams are similar to those faced by many modern businesses that operate in regulated or controversial industries. If you thought modern business regulations were complex, imagine trying to run a customer service business where your core activities could result in execution. Your customers faced social destruction if discovered, and your competitors might inform on you to authorities for competitive advantage. The operators of Molly houses weren't just entrepreneurs. They were economic pioneers who created business models that sustained entire communities. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Molly House culture we've been exploring was beginning to undergo fundamental changes that would ultimately transform it beyond recognition. The forces driving these changes weren't just legal persecution or moral reform. They reflected broader social, economic, and cultural transformations that were reshaping all aspects of Georgian society. Let's be clear about the most important factor in the decline of traditional Mali houses: the massive expansion of London's population and urban development that began in the 1780s and accelerated throughout the early 1800s. The intimate neighborhood-based communities that had sustained Mali house culture were being overwhelmed by rapid urban growth that brought new residents, new businesses, and new forms of social organization. The London that had nurtured Mali houses was a city of maybe 750,000 people, where neighborhood networks and personal relationships could provide protection and community for underground activities. By 1820, London's population exceeded 1 million, and the social structures that had made Mali house culture possible were being replaced by more anonymous and fragmented urban relationships. To be fair, this urban growth also created new opportunities for same-sex socializing that didn't require the elaborate institutional structures of traditional Mali houses. Larger crowds, more diverse entertainment venues, and greater anonymity made it possible for men to meet each other in parks, theaters, taverns, and other public spaces without the risks associated with known Mali house establishments. Meanwhile, the economic changes that accompanied urbanization were altering the customer base and business model that had sustained Mali houses. The rise of industrial capitalism created new forms of wealth and new patterns of social mobility that disrupted the relatively stable class relationships that had characterized Georgian society. Traditional patron-client relationships were being replaced by more commercial and impersonal economic arrangements. The legal context was also evolving in ways that made traditional Mali house operations more difficult. While the basic laws against sodomy remained unchanged, enforcement was becoming more systematic and professional. The development of organized police forces, improved investigation techniques, and more efficient court procedures made it harder for underground establishments to operate with the relative security they had previously enjoyed. Of course, the moral reform movements that had always opposed Mali houses were becoming more organized and politically influential by the early 19th century. The evangelical revival and the rise of middle-class moral activism created sustained pressure for more aggressive enforcement of sexual morality laws. These movements had resources and political connections that earlier critics had lacked. Still, the most significant factor in the transformation of Mali house culture was probably the emergence of new concepts of sexual identity that would eventually be labeled homosexuality. The 18th century Mali houses had served men who engaged in same-sex activity without necessarily developing coherent identities based on their sexual preferences. By the 19th century, new medical and psychological theories were creating categories of sexual identity that would fundamentally alter how people understood these desires. The medicalization of same-sex attraction that began in the early 1800s had complex effects on the communities that had sustained Mali house culture. On one hand, medical theories provided alternative explanations for homosexual behavior that were less morally condemnatory than traditional religious frameworks. On the other hand, medical approaches pathologized same-sex desire in ways that were ultimately just as stigmatizing as religious condemnation. And yet, the decline of traditional Mali houses didn't mean the disappearance of same-sex communities in London. Instead, these communities adapted to changing circumstances by developing new forms of organization, new meeting places, and new survival strategies that reflected the realities of 19th century urban life. The public house culture that emerged in Victorian London provided alternative venues for same-sex socializing that were less visible and less vulnerable than traditional Mali houses. Certain taverns, coffee houses, and social clubs developed reputations as places where men with same-sex interests could meet. But these venues typically avoided the elaborate theatrical culture and explicit sexual commerce that had characterized earlier molly houses. Meanwhile, the expansion of London's parks, gardens, and other public spaces created new opportunities for casual encounters that didn't require institutional support. The development of gaslighting, improved transportation, and extended business hours made it possible for men to socialize in public spaces. During evening hours, when surveillance was less intensive, the class dynamics of same-sex communities were also changing in response to broader social transformations. The growth of a professional middle class created new forms of social organization that were less dependent on aristocratic patronage and working-class service relationships. These changes allowed for more egalitarian social relationships while also creating new forms of social stratification. By the 1820s, the international dimensions of same-sex culture were becoming more important as improved transportation and communication made it easier for communities in different cities to maintain contact and share information. London's same-sex communities developed connections to similar groups in Paris, Amsterdam, and other European cities that provided models for adaptation and survival strategies. Let's be honest about the role that technological change played in transforming same-sex communities during this period. The development of cheap printing made it possible to produce and distribute literature that served these communities, while improvements in transportation allowed for greater mobility and more diverse social networks. These technologies created new possibilities for community organization that were less dependent on fixed physical locations. The literary and artistic dimensions of same-sex culture were also evolving in response to Romantic movement ideas about individual expression and authentic emotion. The elaborate theatrical culture of traditional molly houses was being replaced by more subtle forms of cultural expression that could operate within mainstream artistic and literary institutions. Of course, the legal persecution of same-sex activities continued throughout this period, but it was taking new forms that reflected changing social attitudes and enforcement capabilities. The infamous trials of the Vere Street Coterie in 1810 represented both continuity with earlier molly house prosecutions and important changes in how authorities approached these cases. The Vere Street trials involved a group of men who had been meeting in a tavern that functioned similarly to traditional molly houses. But the legal proceedings revealed how much the social context had changed since the mother-clap trials of the 1720s. The newspaper coverage was more extensive and sensational. The legal procedures were more systematic, and the social consequences were more devastating for everyone involved. Still, the aftermath of the Vere Street trials also demonstrated the resilience of same-sex communities and their ability to adapt to new forms of persecution. Within a few years, new venues and social networks had developed to replace those that had been destroyed, suggesting that the fundamental needs served by these communities remained strong despite changing circumstances. The immigration patterns that developed during this period also reflected the international dimensions of same-sex persecution and community formation. Men who faced legal difficulties in England could sometimes escape to continental Europe or other parts of the British Empire, where enforcement was less intensive or social attitudes were more tolerant. And yet, the transformation of same-sex communities during this period wasn't just about adaptation to external pressures. It also reflected internal changes in how participants understood their identities, relationships, and social roles. The community-oriented culture of traditional molly houses was being replaced by more individualized approaches to same-sex relationships that emphasize privacy and discretion over public socialization. The economic foundations of same-sex communities were also changing as commercial relationships became more important and patron-client relationships became less significant. The rise of wage labor and commercial entertainment created new forms of sex work and social organization that were less dependent on traditional household structures. Meanwhile, the geographic distribution of same-sex activities was expanding beyond the traditional Molly House neighborhoods as London's growth created new areas of settlement and commercial development. This geographic expansion provided opportunities for greater diversity in community organization while also making surveillance and control more difficult for authorities. The cultural legacy of Molly House culture continued to influence same-sex communities even as the institutional forms disappeared. The theatrical traditions, social rituals, and community structures that had developed in 18th century Molly houses provided models that were adapted and modified by later generations of same-sex communities. By the 1830s, the transformation was largely complete. The Molly houses that had provided community and commerce for same-sex relationships during the Georgian period had largely disappeared, replaced by more diverse and less visible forms of social organization that reflected the realities of early Victorian society. That's right. The decline of Molly houses wasn't just about persecution or moral reform. It reflected fundamental changes in urban society, economic organization, and cultural understanding that made these particular institutional forms obsolete while creating new possibilities for same-sex community formation. Sound familiar? It should, because this pattern of institutional adaptation and transformation in response to changing social conditions is common to all marginalized communities. The specific forms change, but the underlying human needs for community, identity, and belonging persist across different historical periods and social contexts. If you thought social change was rapid in the modern world, consider how completely the Molly House culture of Georgian London was transformed within a few decades of urbanization, industrialization, and cultural change. The people who had built these communities showed remarkable creativity in adapting to new circumstances, while preserving the essential human connections that had originally brought them together. The story of Molly houses ultimately reveals both the fragility and the resilience of marginalized communities. These institutions could be destroyed by changing social conditions, but the human needs they served were powerful enough to generate new forms of organization that served similar functions under different circumstances. Their legacy lives on not in specific institutions, but in the ongoing human struggle to create community and belonging despite social hostility and legal persecution. Let's dive into one of the most fascinating aspects of Molly House culture that we haven't fully explored yet: the elaborate system of codes, signals, and secret languages that these communities developed to protect themselves and communicate safely in a hostile world. Because when your very existence is illegal, you don't just need meeting places. You need an entire alternative communication system that can operate under the noses of authorities without detection. The linguistic innovations that emerged from Molly House culture were remarkably sophisticated, involving everything from specialized vocabulary to elaborate behavioral codes that allowed community members to identify each other, communicate intentions, and share information while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by suspicious outsiders. To be fair, the development of underground argot and coded communication wasn't unique to Molly houses. Every marginalized community in Georgian London had some form of specialized language that served protective functions. Thieves had their cant, prostitutes had their slang, and various trades had their technical vocabularies. But Molly House culture developed particularly elaborate linguistic systems because the stakes were literally life and death. The basic vocabulary of Molly culture included dozens of specialized terms that had specific meanings within the community while appearing harmless to outsiders. Molly itself could refer to an individual, a gathering, or the entire subculture depending on context. Madge was another term for community members. while marriage referred to relationships that might be temporary or permanent, commercial, or romantic. Meanwhile, the theatrical traditions of Molly houses contributed to the development of elaborate role-playing vocabularies that allowed participants to adopt alternative identities and explore different social positions. The feminine names and personas that many Molly house patrons adopted weren't just entertainment. They were functional identity categories that provided psychological protection and community recognition. Of course, the geographic codes used by Molly house communities were equally important for practical survival. Certain locations, times, and circumstances were designated by code words or phrases that allowed community members to communicate meeting information without explicitly stating illegal intentions. A seemingly innocent conversation about attending a tea party might actually be arranging a Molly house gathering. The clothing and fashion codes developed by Molly house culture provided visual communication systems that were sophisticated enough to convey complex information while remaining invisible to uninitiated observers. Specific colors, styles, accessories, or ways of wearing ordinary clothing could indicate community membership, availability for companionship, or warnings about potential dangers. Still, the behavioral codes used in Molly houses were perhaps the most elaborate aspect of their communication systems. Specific gestures, mannerisms, ways of walking or speaking could identify community members to each other while appearing completely normal to outside observers. These behavioral patterns required considerable practice and social intelligence to master effectively. And yet, the religious and moral vocabulary that Molly house communities appropriated and subverted reveals their sophisticated understanding of the ideological systems that oppressed them. They developed elaborate parodies of religious ceremonies, moral rhetoric, and social conventions that simultaneously mocked their oppressors and created alternative meaning systems for their own communities. The commercial codes used in Molly house transactions weren't necessarily discreet because explicit. Negotiation for illegal services could provide evidence for prosecution. Elaborate euphemisms, indirect references, and coded pricing systems allowed customers and service providers to negotiate arrangements without creating legal vulnerabilities for anyone involved. Let's be honest about the role that literary and cultural references played in Molly house communication systems. Many community members were educated and used their familiarity with classical literature, contemporary poetry, and theatrical traditions to create sophisticated reference systems that were completely opaque to uneducated observers, but rich with meaning for initiated participants. Meanwhile, the temporal codes used by Molly house communities reflected their need to coordinate activities while avoiding detection. Specific times, days, or seasonal patterns were designated for different types of gatherings or activities, allowing community members to maintain social connections without creating predictable patterns that authorities could easily monitor. The international dimensions of Molly house culture also contributed to the development of communication systems that could operate across national boundaries. Community members who traveled between London and other European cities needed ways to identify safe venues and trustworthy contacts in foreign environments where local customs and languages might be unfamiliar. Of course, the intergenerational transmission of Molly house culture required elaborate systems for educating new community members about proper behavior, safe practices, and community traditions without creating formal educational institutions that would attract official attention. This informal education typically occurred through mentorship relationships and gradual socialization processes. The musical and artistic codes developed by Molly house communities provided additional layers of communication that were particularly resistant to outside interpretation. Specific songs, dances, artistic styles, or cultural references could convey complex community meanings while appearing to be ordinary entertainment to uninformed observers. And yet, the constant evolution of Molly House communication systems reflects the dynamic nature of underground culture and the ongoing pressure to stay ahead of authorities, who were learning to decode existing systems. Community leaders had to continuously innovate new forms of communication while ensuring that changes were transmitted effectively to all community members. The psychological functions served by Molly House communication systems extended beyond simple practical protection to include identity formation, community bonding, and emotional support. Having a shared language and cultural system provided community members with a sense of belonging and validation that was completely unavailable in mainstream society. Still, the documentation of Molly House communication systems that survives in court records and contemporary accounts reveals only partial information about these elaborate cultural innovations. The most sensitive and effective codes were probably never recorded in writing, being transmitted only through direct personal contact and oral tradition. The class dynamics within Molly House communities were reflected in their communication systems, with different social groups developing specialized vocabularies and behavioral codes that marked their status within the underground hierarchy. Wealthy patrons, working-class customers, and service providers each had distinctive linguistic patterns that reflected their roles and relationships. Meanwhile, the regional variations in Molly House culture across different London neighborhoods contributed to the development of local communication dialects that could identify someone's community affiliations and geographic origins. These local variations provided additional layers of meaning and belonging while also creating potential barriers to communication between different community segments. The legacy of Molly House communication systems extended beyond their immediate historical context to influence later same-sex communities and eventually contribute to the development of modern LGBTQ culture. Many of the linguistic innovations, behavioral codes, and cultural practices that originated in 18th century Molly houses can be traced through subsequent generations of underground communities. That's right, the secret languages and communication systems developed by Molly House communities weren't just practical survival tools. They were sophisticated cultural innovations that created alternative meaning systems and identity categories that provided the foundation for later developments in sexual minority culture and community organization. Sound familiar? It should, because marginalized communities throughout history have developed similar communication strategies for protecting themselves while maintaining community connections. The specific forms change, but the underlying need for safe communication and cultural expression remains constant across different social contexts and historical periods. If you thought modern internet culture was complex in its use of codes, memes, and insider references, imagine having to develop an entire alternative communication system where a misunderstood signal or inappropriate reference could literally get you executed. The linguistic creativity of Molly House communities represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural innovation under extreme pressure in human history. Now let's explore an aspect of Molly House culture that reveals just how sophisticated and far-reaching these communities actually were. Their international connections and the global networks that linked London's underground establishments to similar venues and communities across Europe and beyond. Because while we've been focusing on London's unique Molly House culture, the reality is that these communities were part of a much larger international phenomenon. The cosmopolitan nature of 18th century London meant that the city's Molly houses served not just local customers, but also visitors from across Europe and the broader British Empire. Wealthy travelers, military officers, diplomatic personnel, merchants, and other international visitors contributed to the customer base while also creating connections between London's underground communities, and similar groups in their home countries. To be fair, the international dimensions of same-sex culture in the 18th century were facilitated by the elite's tendency to travel extensively for education, business, and pleasure. Young aristocrats undertaking grand tours of Europe, military officers serving in different theaters, and diplomatic personnel maintaining international relationships created informal networks that could provide introductions to underground communities. In different cities, the most well-documented international connections involved exchanges between London and Paris, where similar Molly House establishments operated under somewhat different legal and social conditions. French attitudes towards same-sex relationships were complex and varied considerably depending on political circumstances. But Paris maintained underground venues that served functions similar to London's Molly Houses. Meanwhile, Amsterdam had developed its own version of Molly House culture that was actually more visible and established than London's underground scene. The Dutch tolerance for religious and social diversity created conditions where same-sex communities could operate with somewhat greater security, making Amsterdam an attractive destination for Englishmen who face particular risks at home. Of course, the military connections between different European countries created additional opportunities for international networking within same-sex communities. British officers serving in Mediterranean campaigns, continental wars, or colonial postings often encountered different cultural attitudes towards same-sex relationships that influenced their understanding of possibilities for community organization. The trading relationships that connected London to ports across Europe and the Atlantic also created opportunities for same-sex networking that transcended national boundaries. Sailors, merchants, and other commercial travelers often had knowledge of underground venues in different cities that could provide introductions and connections for London-based community members. Still, the diplomatic networks that linked European capitals provided some of the most sophisticated international connections for elite members of Molly House communities. Ambassadors, attaches, and other diplomatic personnel often had access to international social circles that included men with same-sex interests who could provide connections to underground communities in different countries. And yet, the international legal variations in how different countries treated same-sex relationships created both opportunities and dangers for travelers seeking underground communities abroad. What was relatively tolerated in one country might be severely punished in another, requiring considerable cultural knowledge and social intelligence to navigate safely. The educational networks that connected European universities and intellectual centers also facilitated international connections within same-sex communities. Young men studying abroad often encountered different cultural attitudes and community organizations that influenced their later participation in London's Molly House culture when they returned home. Let's be honest about the role that religious and political exile played in creating international connections between same-sex communities. Men who fled England due to religious persecution, political opposition, or sexual scandals often maintained connections to London's underground while participating in similar communities in their countries of refuge. Meanwhile, the colonial connections of the British Empire created additional international dimensions for London's Molly House culture. Officers and administrators serving in India, the Caribbean, North America, and other imperial territories often encountered different cultural attitudes toward same-sex relationships that influenced their understanding of sexual possibilities and community organization. The cultural exchange that occurred through these international connections contributed to the sophistication and diversity of London's Molly House culture. Ideas about entertainment, social organization, artistic expression, and community protection that originated in other countries were adapted and integrated into London's underground establishments. Of course, the economic networks that connected. European commercial centers also facilitated international connections within same-sex communities. Wealthy merchants and bankers often had business relationships that provided cover for more personal connections to underground communities in different cities. The artistic and literary networks that connected creative communities across Europe provided additional opportunities for international connection within same-sex communities. Writers, artists, musicians, and performers often had professional relationships that could provide introductions to underground cultural scenes in different countries. Still, the language barriers that separated different European countries created challenges for international networking within same-sex communities. French, Italian, German, and other languages required different cultural knowledge and communication skills that not all community members possessed, limiting the accessibility of international connections. And yet, the shared classical education that characterized elite European culture provided common cultural references that could facilitate international connections despite language differences. Latin quotations, classical literary allusions, and shared artistic traditions created communication possibilities that transcended national boundaries. The seasonal migration patterns of European elites also contributed to international networking within same-sex communities. Wealthy individuals who spent summers in spa towns, winters in capital cities, and springs in country estates created predictable opportunities for international socializing that included underground community connections. Meanwhile, the war and diplomatic conflicts that periodically disrupted European international relationships also affected the international dimensions of same-sex communities. Times of political tension could make international connections dangerous, while periods of peace and diplomatic cooperation facilitated more extensive networking. The technological improvements in transportation and communication that occurred throughout the 18th century gradually made international connections easier and more reliable for same-sex communities. Better roads, more frequent shipping, and improved postal services reduced the time and cost of maintaining international relationships. Of course, the intelligence and espionage networks that operated between European countries sometimes intersected with same-sex communities in ways that created additional vulnerabilities and opportunities. The discrete nature of underground communities could provide cover for intelligence activities, while the international connections of community members could attract unwanted attention from security services. The religious networks that connected different European countries also influenced international connections within same-sex communities. Catholic, Protestant, and other religious affiliations created international relationships that could provide introductions to underground communities, while religious persecution sometimes forced community members to seek refuge in countries with different religious traditions. Still, the economic costs and practical challenges of international travel in the 18th century meant that most international connections within same-sex communities were limited to relatively wealthy individuals who had the resources and opportunities for extensive travel. Working-class community members typically had more limited access to international networking, and yet, the cultural influence of international connections within London's Molly House communities extended beyond the individuals who actually traveled abroad. Ideas, practices, and innovations that originated in other countries were transmitted through returning travelers and adapted by local communities that had no direct international experience. The documentation of international connections within same-sex communities is unfortunately limited because these relationships were often the most sensitive and dangerous aspects of underground culture. Participants had strong incentives to maintain secrecy about international connections that could provide evidence of organized conspiracy across national boundaries. That's right. London's Molly houses weren't isolated local phenomena. They were part of a sophisticated international network of same-sex communities that shared information, cultural innovations, and mutual support across national boundaries. Understanding these international connections reveals the global dimensions of 18th century sexual minority culture. Sound familiar? It should, because the international networking of marginalized communities is a persistent feature of human social organization. Modern LGBTQ+ communities, political dissidents, religious minorities, and other marginalized groups continue to maintain international connections that provide mutual support and cultural exchange despite national boundaries and legal restrictions. If you thought modern international networking was complex, imagine maintaining global connections when international travel took weeks or months. Communication across borders was unreliable and monitored, and discovery of these relationships could result in charges of international conspiracy in addition to local sexual offenses. The international networks maintained by 18th century same-sex communities represent remarkable achievements in cultural organization and mutual support. Let's talk about one of the most surprising and often overlooked aspects of Molly house culture: the crucial role played by women in creating, operating, and protecting these establishments. While Molly houses primarily served male customers seeking male companionship, they were often owned, managed, and staffed by women who became central figures in these underground communities. The most famous example, of course, is Margaret Clapp, whose establishment became synonymous with Molly house culture in the public imagination. But Mother Clapp wasn't unique. Court records and contemporary accounts revealed that women operated many of London's most successful Molly houses throughout the 18th century. These weren't just passive business owners. They were active community leaders who shaped the culture and protected the men who depended on their establishments. To be fair, the prominence of women in Molly house operations reflects the broader patterns of 18th century business culture, where women often operated taverns, boarding houses, and other hospitality establishments. The skills required to run Molly houses, managing diverse customers, maintaining discreet operations, handling complex financial arrangements, were extensions of traditional female roles in the service industry. Meanwhile, the legal advantages of having women operate Molly houses were considerable. Female operators faced different legal vulnerabilities than male ones and could sometimes claim ignorance about the specific activities taking place in their establishments. Prosecutors found it harder to argue that women fully understood the implications of male homosexual activity, which provided some protection against the most serious charges. Of course, women who operated Molly houses also brought different social connections and protective relationships that could benefit their establishments. Many had relationships with local authorities, connections to legitimate business networks, and social ties that could provide warnings about potential raids or investigations. The domestic skills that women brought to Molly house operations were crucial for creating the comfortable, welcoming atmospheres that customers sought. Food preparation, household management, cleaning, and the countless other tasks required to maintain hospitality establishments were traditionally female responsibilities that were essential for successful Molly house operations. Still, women's roles in Molly houses extended far beyond traditional domestic functions. Many female operators became confidants, advisors, and emotional supporters for their male customers who had few other sources of understanding and acceptance. They provided motherly care, sisterly companionship, and practical advice that helped men navigate the challenges of underground life. And yet, the relationships between female operators and male customers weren't always harmonious. The business pressures, personal conflicts, and legal risks that characterize Molly house operations created tensions that sometimes erupted into serious disputes. Some women felt exploited by demanding customers, while some men resented female authority in spaces they considered their own. The economic motivations that drew women into Molly House operations were complex and varied, considerably depending on individual circumstances. Some were experienced business operators who recognized profitable opportunities in underserved markets. Others were desperate individuals who turned to risky enterprises because they had limited alternatives for supporting themselves. Let's be honest about the social costs that women paid for their involvement in Molly House culture. Female operators faced moral condemnation, social ostracism, and legal persecution that could destroy their reputations and limit their future opportunities. Many sacrificed conventional respectability to serve communities that desperately needed their support. Meanwhile, the female staff who worked in Molly houses included servers, cleaners, cooks, and entertainers who provided essential services while also participating in the social life of these establishments. Some developed close friendships with male customers, while others maintained more formal business relationships that prioritized financial considerations over personal connections. The protective strategies that women developed for managing Molly House operations reveal remarkable creativity and social intelligence. They learned to read the political climate, maintain relationships with authorities, and navigate the complex legal and social challenges that threatened their establishments and communities. Of course, the involvement of women in Molly House culture wasn't limited to operators and staff. Some female customers also frequented these establishments, either as companions to male friends or as individuals seeking alternative social environments that were unavailable in conventional women's social circles. The female customers of Molly houses included women who were interested in cross-dressing entertainments, women who enjoyed the theatrical culture that characterized these establishments, and women who found the social atmosphere more welcoming than conventional taverns or social venues that could be hostile to unaccompanied women. Still, the presence of women in Molly houses created additional complexity in establishments that were primarily designed to serve male same-sex socializing. Operators had to balance the needs of different customer groups while maintaining the discreet atmosphere that everyone required for their safety and comfort. And yet, the women who participated in Molly House culture often developed strong emotional bonds with the male communities they served. Many became genuine advocates and protectors who risked their own safety to warn customers about potential dangers or provide support during times of crisis. The cross-dressing entertainments that were central to Molly House culture created interesting opportunities for female participation that blurred traditional gender boundaries. Some women participated in the theatrical performances, either as themselves or in male drag, contributing to the complex gender play that characterized these establishments. Meanwhile, the female perspectives on Molly House culture that survive in court testimony and contemporary accounts provide valuable insights into how these communities functioned and what they meant to their participants. Women's observations often focused on different aspects of community life than male accounts, revealing dimensions of Molly House culture that might otherwise be overlooked. The family relationships that some female operators developed with their male customers created alternative kinship structures that provided belonging and support for men who were often estranged from their biological families due to their sexual interests. These chosen family relationships could be among the most important emotional connections in participants' lives. Of course, the legal testimony that women provided in Molly House trials reveals both their insider knowledge of these communities and their complex relationships with the legal system. Some women tried to protect their customers by minimizing evidence, while others cooperated with prosecutors, either voluntarily or under pressure. That the economic independence that successful Molly House operations could provide for female operators was unusual in 18th century society. where women had limited opportunities for business ownership and financial autonomy. Some women achieved considerable wealth and social influence through their underground establishments. Still, the personal costs of Molly House involvement for women included not just legal and social risks, but also the emotional burden of constantly managing dangerous situations and protecting vulnerable people. Many female operators developed remarkable resilience and survival skills that served them throughout their lives. And yet, the women who became central figures in Molly House culture often developed genuine affection and loyalty for the communities they served. Their continued involvement, despite considerable personal risks, suggests that they found meaning and satisfaction in providing essential services for marginalized people who had few alternatives. The legacy of female involvement in Molly House culture contributed to later developments in women's rights and gender equality by demonstrating women's capabilities for business leadership, community organization, and social innovation. Many of the skills and strategies developed by Molly House operators were applicable to other forms of social and political activism. Meanwhile, the relationships between women and gay men that developed in Molly House communities provided models for later alliances between women's rights advocates and sexual minority communities. The mutual support and understanding that characterized many of these relationships transcended their specific historical context. The cultural contributions that women made to Molly House culture included not just practical business skills, but also artistic and creative innovations that enriched the entertainment and social offerings of these establishments. Female perspectives influenced the development of theatrical traditions, social rituals, and community customs that became central to underground culture. That's right, women weren't just peripheral figures in Molly House culture. They were often the central organizing forces that made these communities possible, providing leadership, protection, and support that allowed male same-sex communities to flourish despite systematic persecution. Their contributions deserve recognition as pioneering examples of cross-gender alliance building and community solidarity. Sound familiar? It should, because the alliance between women and sexual minority men has remained a persistent feature of LGBTQ+ history and politics. The relationships that developed in 18th century Molly houses provided early models for the kind of cross-gender coalition building that continues to characterize modern equality movements. If you thought modern gender politics were complex, imagine the dynamics of establishments where traditional gender roles were simultaneously reinforced and subverted, where women held authority over male spaces, and where everyone involved was risking their lives to create alternative communities that challenged fundamental social assumptions about sexuality, gender, and social organization. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the medical and scientific communities were beginning to take systematic interest in the phenomena they observed in Molly House culture, marking the beginning of a transition from purely religious and legal approaches to same-sex sexuality toward what would eventually become medical and psychological frameworks for understanding sexual diversity. The emergence of medical interest in homosexual behavior wasn't initially motivated by humanitarian concerns or scientific curiosity. It was largely driven by legal and social pressures to provide expert testimony in criminal proceedings against Molly House participants. Medical professionals were increasingly called upon to examine defendants, assess their physical condition, and provide opinions about their moral and mental state. To be fair, the medical knowledge available to 18th century practitioners was severely limited when it came to understanding sexual behavior and psychology. Most medical theories about same-sex attraction were based on classical texts, religious doctrine, and popular prejudices rather than systematic observation or clinical experience. The concept of scientific methodology as we understand it today was still in its early development. Meanwhile, The legal system's increasing reliance on medical testimony in Molly House trials reflected broader changes in how Georgian society approached questions of criminal responsibility and mental competence. Courts were beginning to recognize that some behaviors might result from medical conditions rather than simple moral choices, though this recognition was applied very selectively. The physical examinations that doctors conducted on Molly House defendants were often invasive, humiliating, and based on entirely unscientific assumptions about the physical effects of homosexual activity. Medical practitioners claimed they could identify men who engaged in sodomy through physical examination, despite having no actual evidence to support these claims. Of course, the medical theories that emerged during this period about the causes of same-sex attraction reflected the broader intellectual currents of Enlightenment thinking, including attempts to apply rational analysis to human behavior and social phenomena. Unfortunately, these early efforts were often contaminated by moral assumptions and cultural prejudices that undermined their scientific value. Still, some medical practitioners began to recognize that same-sex attraction might be an inherent characteristic rather than a chosen behavior, which represented a significant departure from traditional religious explanations that emphasize moral choice and spiritual corruption. This recognition had complex implications for both legal proceedings and social attitudes, and yet, the medicalization of same-sex sexuality also created new forms of pathologization that were ultimately just as stigmatizing as religious condemnation. Medical theories that labeled homosexual attraction as a disease or defect provided alternative justifications for discrimination and persecution that persisted well into the modern era. The case studies that medical practitioners began to compile from their encounters with Molly House participants represented some of the earliest systematic documentation of same-sex communities and behaviors. While these records were biased by their legal context and medical assumptions, they provide valuable historical information about individual experiences and community dynamics. Let's be honest about the economic motivations that influenced medical involvement in Molly House cases. Providing expert testimony in criminal trials was lucrative for medical practitioners, and the sensational nature of these cases provided opportunities for professional advancement and public recognition that few other medical specialties could offer. Meanwhile, the international medical networks that connected British practitioners with their counterparts in other European countries facilitated the exchange of ideas about same-sex sexuality that contributed to the development of increasingly sophisticated theoretical frameworks. Medical theories developed in France, Germany, and other countries influenced British approaches to these questions. The anatomical theories that medical practitioners developed about same-sex attraction often focused on supposed physical differences that could explain behavioral variations. These theories were generally unsupported by evidence, but reflected broader medical assumptions about the relationship between physical characteristics and behavioral tendencies. Of course, the psychiatric dimensions of medical involvement in Molly House culture were limited by the rudimentary state of psychological understanding in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Mental illness was poorly understood, and the concept of sexual psychology hadn't yet developed into a coherent field of study. The therapeutic approaches that some medical practitioners propose for treating same-sex attraction range from the merely ineffective to the genuinely dangerous. These included dietary modifications, physical exercises, bloodletting, purging, and various other medical interventions that reflected contemporary medical practice rather than any understanding of sexual psychology. Still, some medical practitioners who encountered Molly House participants developed more sophisticated and sympathetic understandings of same-sex attraction than their contemporaries. These individuals sometimes provided testimony that helped defendants avoid the most severe legal penalties. Though their influence was generally limited, and yet, the medical literature that emerged from this period often sensationalized and distorted the reality of Molly House culture for the entertainment of professional and popular audiences. Medical texts frequently emphasize the most exotic and shocking aspects of these communities while ignoring the ordinary social relationships and everyday experiences that characterize most participants' lives. The classification systems that medical practitioners began to develop for different types of same-sex attraction represented early attempts to create scientific taxonomies for sexual behavior. While these systems were primitive and often inaccurate, they provided foundations for later developments in sexology and psychology. Meanwhile, the ethical questions raised by medical involvement in Molly House prosecutions reflected broader concerns about the relationship between medical practice and legal proceedings. Some practitioners questioned whether their professional obligations required them to help prosecute individuals whose behaviors they were beginning to understand as medical rather than criminal matters. The demographic studies that emerged from medical encounters with Molly House participants provided some of the earliest statistical information about same-sex communities. While these studies were limited by their legal context and selection bias, they offered insights into the social characteristics and life experiences of underground community members. Of course, the medical theories about same-sex attraction that developed during this period were heavily influenced by broader social attitudes about gender, sexuality, and social order. Medical practitioners were products of their cultural environment and generally shared the prejudices and assumptions of their social class and historical period. The comparative studies that some medical practitioners conducted between different European countries' approaches to same-sex sexuality provided early examples of cross-cultural research in human sexuality. These studies revealed significant variations in legal treatment, social attitudes, and medical approaches that influenced theoretical development. Still, the individual case histories that medical practitioners compiled from their encounters with Molly House participants often revealed the human complexity and diversity that was obscured by legal proceedings and popular stereotypes. These records sometimes captured genuine insights into participants' experiences, motivations, and perspectives. And yet, the medical involvement in Molly House culture also contributed to the development of surveillance and control mechanisms that made underground communities more vulnerable to persecution. Medical knowledge was often used to improve detection and prosecution rather than to promote understanding or tolerance. The forensic techniques that medical practitioners developed for Molly House investigations represented early examples of scientific criminology. While these techniques were often based on false assumptions, they demonstrated the growing influence of scientific approaches to legal questions. Meanwhile, the theoretical debates that emerged within the medical community about the nature and causes of same-sex attraction provided foundations for later scientific research in human sexuality. These debates established many of the basic questions that would continue to influence scientific inquiry for centuries. The publication of medical findings about same-sex sexuality in professional journals and popular texts helped disseminate new ideas about sexual diversity to broader audiences. While this publication often reinforced negative stereotypes, it also introduced more sophisticated theoretical frameworks that challenged simplistic moral explanations. Of course, the medical involvement in Molly House culture occurred during a period of rapid change in medical theory and practice that influenced how practitioners approached these questions. The development of clinical medicine, anatomical research, and psychological theory all contributed to evolving understandings of human sexuality. The legacy of early medical involvement in Molly House culture includes both positive contributions to scientific understanding and negative consequences for sexual minority communities. Medical approaches provided alternatives to purely religious or legal frameworks, while also creating new forms of pathologization and control. That's right. The medical and scientific interest in Molly House culture represented both progress and setback in how society understood same-sex sexuality. While medical approaches offered more sophisticated theoretical frameworks than simple moral condemnation, they also created new justifications for discrimination and persecution that proved remarkably persistent. Sound familiar? It should, because the tension between medical authority and minority community self-determination continues to characterize debates about sexual and gender diversity. The relationship between scientific research and social justice remains complex and sometimes contradictory, reflecting broader questions about expertise, power, and social change. If you thought modern medical approaches to sexual and gender diversity were complicated, imagine the challenges faced by 18th century practitioners who were trying to develop scientific understanding without adequate theoretical frameworks, research methods, or cultural concepts for comprehending the phenomena they encountered in Molly House communities. Let's dive deeper into one of the most fascinating and misunderstood aspects of Molly House culture: the elaborate theatrical performances that weren't just entertainment, but sophisticated strategies for survival, identity exploration, and community building. Because when your very existence is criminalized, performance becomes more than art. It becomes a matter of life and death. The theatrical traditions that developed in Molly houses were far more complex than simple cross-dressing entertainment. These performances created elaborate alternative worlds where participants could safely explore different identities, social roles, and relationships that were completely impossible in their everyday lives. Think of them as early forms of immersive theater, except the audience was also the cast, and the stakes were considerably higher than modern performance art. To be fair, the cross-dressing performances that characterize Molly House culture built on existing theatrical traditions in Georgian London, where male actors regularly played female roles in legitimate theaters and masquerade. Balls featured elaborate costume entertainments. But Molly House performances took these traditions in directions that were both more subversive and more psychologically complex. The mock weddings that became signature events in Molly House culture weren't just parodies of heterosexual marriage. They were genuine rituals that created real relationships and community bonds within underground society. These ceremonies featured elaborate preparations, formal vows, wedding feasts, and honeymoon retirements that provided participants with experiences of public recognition and celebration that were completely unavailable in legitimate society. Meanwhile, the feminine personas that many Molly House participants adopted weren't just temporary theatrical roles. They were alternative identities that could provide psychological protection and community belonging. Having a recognized feminine name and character within Molly House culture allowed men to explore aspects of their personalities and desires that had no acceptable expression in conventional masculine society. Of course, the theatrical skills required for successful Molly House performances were considerable and often took years to develop. Participants had to master not just costume and makeup techniques, but also voice modulation, gestural patterns, social mannerisms, and cultural knowledge that could make their performances convincing and entertaining. The costume culture that developed around Molly House performances was remarkably sophisticated, involving elaborate gowns, jewelry, wigs, and accessories that often rivaled the fashions of wealthy women in legitimate society. Some participants invested considerable time and money in developing theatrical wardrobes that became central to their community identities and social status. Still, the performances weren't just about individual expression. They were community events that brought people together and created shared cultural experiences that strengthened social bonds. The preparation, execution, and aftermath of theatrical events provided opportunities for cooperation, creativity, and celebration that were essential for maintaining community cohesion under hostile circumstances. And yet, the theatrical culture of molly houses also served important protective functions by providing plausible explanations for behaviors that might otherwise be interpreted as evidence of illegal sexual activity. If authorities discovered men in women's clothing, claiming they were engaged in harmless, theatrical entertainment was less legally dangerous than admitting to sexual relationships. The audience participation that characterized molly house performances created unique forms of interactive entertainment where the boundaries between performers and spectators were deliberately blurred. Everyone could potentially become part of the show, which created democratic forms of cultural participation that were rare in Georgian society's generally hierarchical entertainment culture. Let's be honest about the role that alcohol played in molly house theatrical culture, because drinking wasn't just social lubrication. It was often essential for overcoming the psychological barriers that prevented men from fully participating in cross-gender performances. The social effects of alcohol helped create the relaxed atmosphere necessary for effective community theater. Meanwhile, the musical dimensions of molly house performances included not just popular songs and dances of the period, but also specialized musical traditions that developed within underground communities. Some establishments featured regular musical entertainments that combined professional performance with community participation in ways that created unique cultural experiences. The competitive aspects of molly house performance culture motivated participants to develop increasingly elaborate and skilled presentations that enhanced the overall quality of community entertainment. Informal competitions for the best costumes, most convincing performances, or most creative presentations encouraged artistic innovation and skill development. Of course, the seasonal patterns of molly house theatrical culture reflected both the broader rhythms of Georgian social life and the specific needs of underground communities. Special performances for holidays, celebrations, and community milestones provided regular opportunities for collective cultural expression that helped maintain community identity and solidarity. The improvisation skills that participants developed through molly house performances often served them well in other aspects of underground life, where the ability to quickly adapt to changing circumstances and create convincing alternative explanations for suspicious behavior was essential for survival. Still, the emotional function served by molly house theatrical culture extended far beyond entertainment to include identity validation, psychological healing, and community building that was crucial for people who faced constant rejection and persecution in mainstream society. Performance provided safe spaces for authentic self-expression that was unavailable elsewhere. And yet, the documentation of molly house theatrical culture that survives in court records and contemporary accounts often misrepresents these performances by emphasizing their most sensational aspects while ignoring their genuine artistic merit and psychological importance for participants. The influence of molly house theatrical traditions on broader Georgian entertainment culture is often overlooked. But these underground communities were cultural laboratories that experimented with new forms of performance, costume design, and audience participation that sometimes influenced legitimate theater and social entertainment. The class dynamics within molly house performance culture reflected both the broader social hierarchies of Georgian society and the specific dynamics of underground communities. Wealthy participants could afford more elaborate costumes and entertainment, but skill and creativity could provide working-class performers with high status within community cultural hierarchies. Meanwhile, the intergenerational transmission of molly house theatrical traditions required informal educational systems where experienced performers mentored newcomers in the skills, customs, and cultural knowledge necessary for successful participation. This mentorship often involved deep personal relationships that extended far beyond simple skill instruction. The regional variations in Molly House theatrical culture across different London neighborhoods created distinct local traditions that reflected the specific social, economic, and cultural characteristics of different communities. These variations contributed to the overall diversity and richness of underground cultural life. That's right. The theatrical culture of Molly houses wasn't just frivolous entertainment. It was a sophisticated form of cultural resistance that allowed marginalized people to create alternative worlds where they could safely explore their authentic selves while building the community bonds necessary for survival under hostile circumstances. Sound familiar? It should, because the use of performance and theater as tools for identity exploration, community building, and cultural resistance remains central to LGBTQ culture today. Drag performance, community theater, and other forms of creative expression continue to serve similar functions for sexual and gender minorities seeking authentic self-expression and community belonging. If you thought modern performance art was complex in its relationship to identity and politics, imagine creating elaborate theatrical traditions where every performance was simultaneously artistic expression, psychological therapy, community building, and potentially life-saving camouflage for illegal activities. The theatrical innovations of Molly House culture represent remarkable achievements in creative survival under extreme pressure. As we near the end of our journey through the hidden world of Georgian London's Molly houses, it's time to reflect on what these remarkable communities can teach us about human resilience, social change, and the ongoing struggle for acceptance and belonging that continues to shape our world today. Because while the specific circumstances have changed dramatically, the fundamental human dynamics we've explored remain surprisingly relevant to contemporary challenges. The most obvious legacy of Molly House culture lies in its contribution to the historical development of LGBTQ+ communities and activism. The survival strategies, cultural innovations, and community building techniques that were pioneered in 18th century underground establishments provided foundations for later generations of sexual and gender minorities who faced similar challenges of persecution, marginalization, and social exclusion. To be fair, drawing direct lines between Molly House culture and modern LGBTQ movements requires considerable caution, since the historical contexts, legal frameworks, and cultural understandings of sexuality have changed so dramatically. The men who frequented Molly houses didn't necessarily think of themselves as gay in modern terms, and their communities served different functions than contemporary activist organizations. Meanwhile, the entrepreneurial innovations that Molly House operators developed for managing underground businesses under hostile legal conditions have influenced countless other marginalized communities seeking to create economic opportunities and social institutions. Despite systematic discrimination, the basic challenges of discrete operation, diverse customer service, and risk management remain relevant for many contemporary social enterprises. The communication strategies and cultural codes that Molly House communities developed for safe interaction in hostile environments have been adapted and modified by numerous other underground movements throughout history. Resistance organizations, religious minorities, political dissidents, and other marginalized groups have employed similar techniques for maintaining community while avoiding persecution. Of course, the alliance-building strategies that connected Molly House communities to sympathetic individuals and institutions in mainstream society provide models that remain relevant for contemporary minority rights movements. The ability to build bridges with allies while maintaining community authenticity is just as challenging today as it was in Georgian London. the international networking that linked Molly House communities to similar groups in other countries, anticipated the global dimensions of modern human rights movements and minority advocacy organizations. The challenges of maintaining international solidarity while respecting local cultural differences continue to influence contemporary activism and community organizing. Still, perhaps the most important legacy of Molly House culture lies in its demonstration that marginalized communities can create meaningful institutions and cultural traditions, even under the most hostile circumstances. The creativity, resilience, and determination shown by these communities provides inspiration for anyone facing systematic oppression or social exclusion. And yet, the Molly House experience also reveals the limitations and costs of underground resistance strategies. While these communities provided essential services and support for their members, they also required enormous personal sacrifices and operated under constant stress that took significant psychological and social tolls on participants. The class dynamics that characterize Molly House communities continue to influence contemporary discussions about privilege, access, and equity within minority communities. The ability of wealthy individuals to purchase safety and discretion while working class people face greater risks reflects ongoing patterns of inequality that affect many marginalized groups today. Let's be honest about the parallels between Molly House persecution and contemporary attacks on LGBTQ+ rights in many parts of the world. The moral panic rhetoric, legal persecution, and social stigmatization that characterized 18th century campaigns against Molly Houses bear uncomfortable similarities to modern anti-LGBTQ movements and legislation. Meanwhile, the medical and scientific frameworks that began to emerge during the Molly House period anticipated many of the ongoing debates about sexuality, gender, and identity that continue to influence contemporary politics and social policy. The tension between community self-determination and expert authority remains a central issue in many minority rights struggles. The role of women as allies and community leaders in Molly House culture provided early models for the cross-gender coalition building that characterizes many contemporary equality movements. The mutual support and understanding that developed between women and gay men in these underground communities established patterns that continue to influence progressive politics today. Of course, the technological innovations that facilitated Molly House operations, from improved transportation and communication to new forms of printing and information distribution, anticipated many of the ways that modern technology has transformed minority community organizing and cultural expression. The economic models that Molly House operators developed for sustainable underground enterprises continue to influence contemporary social entrepreneurs who seek to create businesses and organizations that serve marginalized communities while operating within hostile legal and social environments. Still, the Molly House experience also demonstrates the importance of legal and social reform for minority community development. While underground resistance strategies can provide essential services and preserve community culture, long-term progress typically requires broader changes in law, policy, and social attitudes. And yet, the cultural innovations that emerged from Molly House communities, from theatrical traditions to social rituals to communication systems, have influenced mainstream culture in ways that are often unrecognized. Many aspects of contemporary entertainment, fashion, and social organization can be traced back to innovations that originated in marginalized communities. The survival strategies that Molly House participants developed for managing multiple identities and navigating hostile social environments remain relevant for many people who continue to face discrimination or persecution based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, religious beliefs, political views, or other characteristics. Meanwhile, the community care and mutual support systems that Molly House culture developed provide models for contemporary movements that seek to create alternative support networks for people who are failed or excluded by mainstream institutions. The emphasis on collective responsibility and community solidarity remains central to many grassroots organizing efforts. The documentation challenges that affect our understanding of Mali house culture, the bias towards sensational legal records, the absence of participant voices, the distortion created by hostile observers, continue to influence how marginalized communities are represented in historical accounts and contemporary media coverage. Of course, the psychological resilience and creative adaptation that Mali house participants demonstrated in the face of systematic persecution provides inspiration for anyone dealing with discrimination, marginalization, or social hostility. Their example shows that human dignity and community connection can survive even under the most challenging circumstances. The political implications of Mali house culture, its challenge to traditional gender roles, its creation of alternative social institutions, its demonstration of minority community capacity for self-organization, continue to influence contemporary debates about social change, minority rights, and the relationship between individual freedom and social order. Still, perhaps the most important lesson from Mali house culture is that human needs for community, belonging, and authentic self-expression are powerful enough to overcome enormous obstacles and create remarkable institutions, even under the most hostile circumstances. This lesson remains relevant for anyone seeking to build inclusive communities or support marginalized people. And yet, the Mali house experience also reminds us that progress toward equality and inclusion is neither inevitable nor permanent. The gains that marginalized communities achieve can be lost, and the tolerance that develops in one historical period can be replaced by renewed persecution and discrimination. That's right. The Mali houses of Georgian London weren't just historical curiosities. They were early examples of the ongoing human struggle to create community, express authentic identity, and build meaningful institutions despite systematic opposition. Their legacy lives on in contemporary movements for equality, inclusion, and social justice around the world. Sound familiar? It should, because the fundamental challenges that Mali house communities faced, legal persecution, social stigma, economic discrimination, cultural marginalization, continue to affect marginalized communities today. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying dynamics of resistance, resilience, and community building remain remarkably consistent across different historical periods and social contexts. If you thought the challenges facing contemporary minority communities were unprecedented, the Mali house experience demonstrates that marginalized people have always found creative ways to build community and support each other despite systematic opposition. Their example provides both inspiration for contemporary activists and important lessons about the ongoing nature of struggles for human dignity and social inclusion. As we close the book on our exploration of Georgian London's Mali houses, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what this hidden history reveals about the complexity of human nature, the persistence of community, and the ongoing struggle between individual authenticity and social conformity that continues to shape our world today. The story we've uncovered isn't just about a specific group of establishments in 18th century London. It's about the remarkable human capacity to create meaning, community, and joy, even under the most hostile circumstances. The men and women who built and sustained Mali house culture weren't superhuman heroes or villains from a distant past. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges who found creative ways to live authentic lives while protecting themselves and each other from a society that literally wanted them dead. Let's be clear about what makes this history so remarkable. It's not just that these communities existed despite systematic persecution, but that they thrived and created genuine innovations in entertainment, business, social organization, and cultural expression. Molly houses weren't just survival mechanisms. They were laboratories of human creativity that produced lasting contributions to broader culture. The entrepreneurs who operated these establishments developed business models that balanced profit with protection, service with security, and individual needs with community welfare in ways that would challenge modern management consultants. They created sustainable enterprises under conditions that would bankrupt most contemporary businesses, while providing essential services that their society refused to acknowledge. To be fair, celebrating Molly House culture shouldn't blind us to the genuine costs and limitations of underground resistance strategies. The participants in these communities paid enormous personal prices for their involvement: psychological stress, social isolation, financial burden, and constant fear that took real tolls on their health and happiness. Many lived double lives that were emotionally exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. Meanwhile, the class inequalities that characterize Molly House culture remind us that even marginalized communities reproduce broader social hierarchies and power dynamics. Wealthy customers had access to safety and services that working-class participants couldn't afford, and the most vulnerable community members often bore the greatest risks while receiving the fewest protections. Of course, the limited documentation that survives from Molly House culture means that many voices and experiences remain hidden from historical view. We know far more about the wealthy, educated participants who left written records or appeared in court proceedings than we do about the working-class men and women who formed the backbone of these communities, but whose stories were rarely considered worth preserving. Still, what emerges from the fragmentary evidence is a picture of communities that were far more diverse, complex, and sophisticated than the stereotypes and sensational accounts would suggest. These weren't just spaces of sexual license or criminal activity. They were genuine social institutions that provided belonging, support, and cultural expression for people who had few other options for authentic community participation. The international dimensions of Molly House culture that we've explored reveal how local communities were connected to broader networks of resistance and survival that transcended national boundaries. The exchange of ideas, strategies, and cultural innovations between different cities and countries created a form of early globalization that connected marginalized communities across vast distances. And yet, the regional and local variations in Molly House culture also demonstrate the importance of adapting resistance strategies to specific social, legal, and economic conditions. What worked in London might not work in Amsterdam or Paris, and successful community organizers had to understand their local context while learning from experiences elsewhere. The technological innovations that facilitated Molly House operations improved transportation, communication, printing, and urban infrastructure remind us that social change is often enabled by technological development, but that technology alone doesn't determine social outcomes. Human creativity and determination were essential for transforming technological possibilities into actual community institutions. Let's be honest about the moral complexity of Molly House culture, which included activities and relationships that resist simple ethical categorization. Some participants were clearly exploited, while others found genuine empowerment and fulfillment. Some operators prioritized profit over community welfare, while others made enormous personal sacrifices to protect and serve their customers. Meanwhile, the legal persecution that these communities faced reveals uncomfortable truths about the relationship between law and justice that remain relevant today. The Georgian legal system that executed men for consensual sexual activity while tolerating massive public corruption and violence demonstrates how legal authority can be used to enforce social conformity rather than protect individual rights or promote general welfare. the women who played crucial roles in Molly House culture deserve particular recognition for their courage, creativity, and commitment to communities that offered them few obvious benefits. Female operators like Margaret Clapp risked their reputations, their freedom, and their lives to create spaces where marginalized men could find community and support. Their contributions challenged traditional narratives about women's roles in historical resistance movements. Of course, the medical and scientific interest in Molly House culture that developed during the later Georgian period anticipated many contemporary debates about expertise, authority, and minority community self-determination. The tension between professional knowledge and lived experience that characterized early medical approaches to homosexuality continues to influence current discussions about sexual and gender diversity. The theatrical traditions that emerged from Molly House culture provide particularly rich examples of how marginalized communities use performance and cultural expression as tools for identity exploration, community building, and psychological survival. The cross-dressing entertainments, mock weddings, and elaborate social rituals weren't just frivolous diversions. They were sophisticated forms of cultural resistance that created alternative worlds where authentic self-expression was possible. Still, perhaps the most important lesson from Molly House culture is that human dignity and community connection can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy them. The persistence of these communities, despite constant legal threats, social stigma, and economic pressure, demonstrates the remarkable resilience of human bonds and the power of collective resistance to oppressive conditions. And yet, the ultimate transformation and decline of traditional Molly House culture also reminds us that social institutions must adapt to changing conditions or risk obsolescence. The communities that survived were those that developed new strategies for serving human needs while responding to evolving social, legal, and economic circumstances. The legacy of Molly House culture extends far beyond its immediate historical context to influence contemporary understanding of community organizing, minority rights, cultural resistance, and social change. The strategies, innovations, and insights that emerged from these underground communities continue to provide models and inspiration for people facing discrimination and marginalization today. Meanwhile, the documentation challenges that affect our understanding of Molly House culture highlight the importance of preserving and amplifying marginalized voices in historical research and contemporary social movements. The stories that survive are often those that were considered worth preserving by dominant institutions, which means that alternative perspectives and experiences are frequently lost or distorted. The economic innovations that Molly House operators developed for sustainable underground enterprises provide insights that remain relevant for contemporary social entrepreneurs seeking to create businesses and organizations that serve marginalized communities while operating within hostile legal and social environments. Of course, the international networking that connected Molly House communities to similar groups in other countries anticipated the global dimensions of modern human rights movements and minority advocacy organizations. The challenges of maintaining international solidarity while respecting local cultural differences continue to influence contemporary activism and community organizing. The cultural contributions that emerged from Molly House communities, from linguistic innovations to theatrical traditions to social rituals, have influenced mainstream culture in ways that are often unrecognized but remain significant. Many aspects of contemporary entertainment, fashion, and social organization can be traced back to innovations that originated in marginalized communities. That's right. The Molly Houses of Georgian London weren't just historical curiosities or footnotes to the real history of social and political development. They were significant institutions that served genuine human needs, created lasting cultural innovations, and provided models for resistance and survival that continue to influence contemporary social movements. Sound familiar? It should, because the fundamental challenges that Molly House communities faced, legal persecution, social stigma, economic discrimination, cultural marginalization, continue to affect marginalized communities around the world today. Their example demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of underground resistance while providing inspiration for ongoing struggles for human dignity and social inclusion. As we conclude this journey through a hidden chapter of London's history, we're left with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human community, the persistence of resistance, and the ongoing relevance of historical experience for contemporary challenges. The Molly Houses may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every community that refuses to accept marginalization and continues to fight for the right to exist, belong, and thrive on their own terms. The men and women who created Molly House culture weren't perfect, and their communities weren't utopian, but they demonstrated something essential about human nature, that the need for authentic community and meaningful connection is strong enough to overcome enormous obstacles and create remarkable institutions, even under the most hostile circumstances. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was 3 centuries ago, and it will continue to inspire and guide anyone working to build a more inclusive and just society.